There we go. Okay, welcome everyone. Looks like we have a number of participants here this afternoon in addition to our presenters. So this is session 14.5 at LERA's 73rd annual meeting. It's the Best Papers panel on wages. So I want to welcome everyone to today's discussion. We've got a brisk 60 minutes to get through four research presentations from a star-studded cast. We've got two presentations from PhD candidates, as well as two presentations from faculty members that have contributed on various topics within wages. So I want to welcome all of those folks to the presentation today. For your brief reference, all names of presenters as well as presentations are listed in the program, and if you go to the box site that LERA has provided, you can see the published research as well as the biographies of everyone today. I will introduce everyone in turn. We're going to go through the presentations in alphabetical order, so we'll start with Mr. Hinkel. And just as a reminder, I have clicked the record button for today's presentation. For everyone that's attending, please know that you're being recorded. It will be posted for folks to review after the session is over. And just as a final note, we will try to save a few minutes at the end of the hour for any questions for the presenters. But, you know, this is pretty informal, even though I am wearing a tie. So please, if you have any questions, you can certainly use the chat. I can reference the chat if you'd prefer me to ask those questions on your behalf at the end, or we can allow folks to unmute and ask those questions directly. Alrighty, so we'll get started first with Mr. Hinkel. Matt Hinkel is a PhD candidate at Michigan State, and he's going to talk to us about prevailing wages in the construction industry. Mr. Hinkel.
All right, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you to all of you who are here. So like Michael said, I'm Matt Hinkel, and I'll be presenting on the effect of prevailing wage laws on informal employment in the US construction industry. So I think it's informative to kind of start out with, what do we mean by informality and informal firms? So these are firms who choose and elect to evade certain regulations. These can be labor market regulations, health and safety regulations, and so on. And oftentimes these firms are not registered with tax authorities, such as the IRS, for example. And informal employment has a lot of influences on markets and workers. So for example, in construction labor markets, if you have a lot of firms that are electing to operate informally, you have effectively this race to the bottom, where other firms who otherwise might be law-abiding firms risk being entirely shut out of the market if they do not follow suit and also operate informally. And for workers, in particular misclassified workers, they lose access to unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, even the right to unionization. And so there are effects on both the market side and on the worker side. And I use informal employment in the construction context as sort of an umbrella term to encapsulate two forms of illegal activity and illegal employment in construction. The first is what we're probably more familiar with, which is misclassification of employees as independent contractors. And then the second one is off the books employment. This is where workers are effectively hired and paid under the table in cash. And where this has gotten a lot of attention is, of course, in the gig economy. So, for example, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, rideshare and delivery gig employers. This is what is often most associated with the practice of misclassification. And a good example is the passage of Assembly Bill 5 in California in 2019, which proposed a lot more stringent criteria in defining and separating between independent contractors and employees. But following that, actually just this past November, California approved Proposition 22, which exempted Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and other rideshare and delivery drivers from AB5. And this was as a result of fierce lobbying from Uber and Lyft and others, where they basically said, look, this threatens our business model. If you implement this and don't exempt us, our business model is reliant upon these drivers working as independent contractors. And so effectively, this posed a direct threat to their misclassification-based business model. But when we consider the gig economy, construction is often left out of that conversation, and it really needs to be a part of it. As Mark Ehrlich laid out in a great ILR review paper last year, construction really is the original gig economy in the United States. And I've included this quote here that kind of encapsulates why it can be thought of as a gig economy. Basically, labor supply and demand in construction operates on a project-to-project basis, with each project serving as a separate gig for a highly mobile construction labor force that oftentimes even changes state lines in doing so. And this is also where informal employment and other illegal practices such as wage theft are very rampant. For example, recent work suggests that up to 20% of the national construction labor force is either misclassified or employed off the books. So this issue is not new. It predates rideshare and delivery drivers, and it is a huge issue in the construction industry. And there are also a lot of enforcement issues. There's been a breakdown in enforcement of standing labor law, particularly in residential construction. And a previous research outside of construction suggests that these kinds of enforcement issues increase informal employment. But as I talk about in this study, a potential solution to this issue is prevailing wage laws. So what are prevailing wage laws? The best way to describe them is they're effectively locally determined minimum wages by construction trade. And these are mandated wage rates by construction trade, area, and project type. So for example, say California, which has a prevailing wage law, its own law. If you're an electrician and you're working in San Francisco, for example, you're going to have a different prevailing wage rate than if you were an electrician working in the Los Angeles area, for example. It varies by locality and also by trade. And it's designed to equalize wages paid for similar work done by similar workers in each locality, with what would be paid in the private sector. Again, this focuses on public projects. And there are two types. On the federal level, you have the Davis-Bacon Act, and on the state level, which is the focus of this study, you have what are commonly known as Little Davis-Bacon Acts, which apply Davis-Bacon-like regulations on state-funded construction projects, and these all have varying thresholds. So what explains the persistence of informal labor markets and informal employment in the United States? And there are really three main explanations that have been offered. The first is simply taxes. Firms want to avoid paying as many taxes as possible. They want to keep more profit for themselves. And if they go underground and operate informally, they can then keep more of this profit. The second one, which this study looks at, is weak labor market institutions. When you have limited enforcement that fails to curb it, you still have effectively this race to the bottom that incentivizes more firms to operate informally as firms are able to evade these regulations. And then you have the idea of the fissured workplace, where changing demands of capital markets, technological change have allowed for this workplace fissuring to really take hold in the US, and subcontracting in particular has really taken hold in the construction industry, as Mark Ehrlich talks about. And the literature has also distinguished between regulatory quantity and quality. So when you have a higher quantity, but they're not well enforced, more regulations in the formal labor market cause more firms to leave the formal market and operate informally. But when these regulations have higher quality, higher enforcement, and so on, research has shown that this lowers informal employment. And what makes this study complex, I think why it's needed, is that prevailing wage laws are an increase in both. It's an increase in quality in that it's an additional regulation, but it also has built-in enforcement mechanisms. So on projects that are subject to prevailing wage requirements, you have certified payroll requirements. limits, where firms are required under penalty of law to submit certified payrolls to the government that outlines work classifications, social security numbers, wages paid, and a lot of other information that likely makes informal employment a lot more difficult. And the idea of this study is that prevailing wage laws should lower informal employment because of these built-in enforcement mechanisms. So the challenge with this study, and any study that looks at informal employment, is its measurement, because these activities are by design concealed from direct government oversight. They take place underground. And so to get around this issue, there have been multiple measurement approaches. Some of them being direct, where researchers actually go out and survey various construction firms directly, but there's been an increase in indirect approaches, which deal with comparing two different data sets and looking for discrepancies between the two. And this study follows that approach. So I compare annual household employment data from the American Community Survey against official firm records obtained from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And the idea is, if there are discrepancies here, then that suggests that there is some sort of informal employment going on. And I take this from an industrial relations paper in 2012. They used this simple following equation. So informal employment is the total workforce, which is taken from the household survey side, the self-reported side, minus official employment, which is from the official firm record side, the BEA side. It's indexed by state and year. And from this, they calculate the informal rate, which is simply the amount of informal employment divided by the total workforce. But the issue is, in this study, they only looked at wage and salary employment. And the problem with this, especially in the construction context, is that ignoring the self-employed entirely leaves out wide swaths of informal workers in construction, given that 20%, a recent estimate, 20% of all independent contractors in the US work in construction. So you need to account for this in some way. And the solution that follows recent work is to proxy for informal self-employment using income underreporting rates of self-employed construction workers. And the idea behind this is that a primary goal of informality is to conceal payments and evade taxes. And there was a recent IRS study that suggested that income underreporting rates of self-employed workers, in particular the non-incorporated, the unincorporated self-employed, they underreported their income by 64%. And so I effectively use this as a proxy for informal self-employment, and the equation simply becomes this. It's the previous equation, but it adds on this proxy for informal self-employment in the construction industry. There are limitations, and I'll cover this briefly. There are limitations with this approach. First of all, it's effectively an approximation, right? Because you're comparing two different independent data sources. And also it assumes, one, that industry codes are 100% compatible between the two data sources. And it also assumes that industry codes are both identified and coded correctly on both. You need to make both of these assumptions in order for this method to be viable. Assumption one, there's little concern here because there is a one-to-one comparison available, given that construction is a separate and distinct industry code in both the ACS and the BEA. The second assumption, however, is less certain. There is recent work that suggests that, for example, construction employers, as time goes on, may not update their industry codes with the particular state that they are in. And this can lead to some inaccuracies and some measurement error in using this approach. However, given that, of course, the Census Bureau is considered a gold standard for large-scale data collection in the United States, I am effectively assuming here that the data collected and coded is in totality accurate. So the first hypothesis is that simply the presence of state prevailing wage laws is negatively associated with informal employment. And I have the following model here. And I also control for non-construction informal employment to effectively measure informality in construction against the non-construction average. And I also include state and year fixed effects. And in terms of controls, I'll go over this briefly. I have some construction controls here, state construction union density, and I want to zero in on a couple here. The proportion employed in residential construction. The reason I include this is that residential construction is the part of the industry where you have the most informal employment going on and the most wage theft and other illegal practices going on. So you want to be able to account for different subsectors of the industry. And also with average firm size, I include this because recent research suggests that smaller firms are more likely to be the ones to evade these regulations. And as firm size goes up, you should have a negative association with informality in that sense. I also include some political controls, state minimum wage, and then this idea of preemption. And this is basically a legislative strategy that's really taken hold in the last decade, where if you have a local ordinance, such as a project labor agreement or a fair scheduling law, you can enact state law that preempts that and effectively voids it. And there are a lot of states that have voided through this strategy. They've voided local fair scheduling laws, local paid leave laws, and so on. And so this idea is that if you have preemption going on in a particular state, you're likely to have higher informality. And I use 3 different estimation strategies here: standard regression, and then OLS regression, where I transform the dependent variable given that it is a proportion. This is a common practice. And then I use this other estimation strategy called a generalized linear model, which again is another standard strategy when you have a dependent variable that is a proportion or a percentage.
Mr. Hinkel, I'm to interrupt, but we're at 13 minutes. So if I could just ask you to briefly summarize.
Yes, and then this is the second hypothesis, and the models are effectively the same, except I have prevailing wage strength in as well. And so what these results say, this is for hypothesis 1, prevailing wage laws are associated with a 2% reduction, 1.9% to be exact, in informality in construction. And then these other coefficients are more difficult to interpret, but effectively what we have is that construction workers are 9.5 to 14.1% less likely to be employed informally in states that have prevailing wage laws. And then hypothesis 2 for strength, effectively having an average prevailing wage law is enough to significantly curb informality. And you'll see that the percentage reductions here are very similar to the ones above for hypothesis 1. So effectively the bite is coming from having an average law. And this is consistent with prior research outside of construction, which has shown that having a better regulatory environment significantly reduces informality. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Mr. Hinkel, thanks so much. Very interesting work, and I look forward to questions at the end. Briefly, I realized I neglected to introduce myself at the start of the program. My name is Mike Loconto. I'm an attorney in Boston, and I've been a longtime member of LERA, previously serving as management co-chair for the Higher Education Industry Council for a number of years. So hello, welcome, thank you. Next up, we will move to Ms. Kyoko Suzuki, a PhD candidate at the University of Tokyo, who will speak to us about union effects on wage inequality in Japan. Ms. Suzuki, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So I will talk about union's effect on wage in Japan. Okay. Union's effect on wages have been extensively discussed in the US and other European countries, and there has been generally agreed conclusion, which is union increased wages, reduced returns to workers' characteristics, and compressed the wage structure, leading to less inequality in the labor market. However, research on union effects in Japan has been scarce and inconclusive. Until the 1990s, some research indicated that union has zero or even negative impact on wages. in the 2000s, union may have started to bring positive impact on wages, but there's only very few discussion on wage dispersion and union effect on inequality. The reason of this is mainly due to the lack of appropriate data. So this research tries to reevaluate the union effects on wages by using newly available data, as well as applying new analytical models to the Japanese labor market. So regarding the recent developments in the Japanese labor market, there are two aspects we should remember in considering union effects. First, wages has been stagnant in the last 30 years. The line graph on the left shows average annual wages for full-time employee indexed to 1990s. So the blue line represents the United States, and yellow line represents Japan, and gray lines represent other countries and in Europe and Korea. Japan is the only economy in the major developed countries that has experienced such consistent wage stagnation. And the second aspect is that there has been a steady rise of non-standard type of employees. While regular employees has slightly decreased in the last 30 years, non-regular employees has increased and reached around about 40% of the total employment. And there's a significant disparities in labor conditions between these types of employees, including wages, other benefits, and job securities. And the increase of non-standard employees has an important implication for union influence. I'll explain it in the next slide. So where are union members in the labor market in Japan? This video illustrates the labor market segments and union membership. Labor unions are organized by company basis with union shop systems. So workers hired by unionized firms automatically become union members, but workers hired by non-unionized firms do not have chance to join one. But these principles only apply to regular employees. And non-regular employees have long been excluded from unions, even when they are hired by unionized firms. So only segment A corresponds to union membership in the Japanese labor market. While there are several different aspects to union effect, this paper focuses on the difference between A and B, segment A and B, the effects within regular employees, as most previous studies did. So as for data, this research uses a newly available survey conducted by a research institute affiliated with the largest national trade union center in Japan. And as for analytical models, these have been used to study union effects in other countries, but they are new to Japanese context. I will focus on the decomposition methods to analyze special features of union effects in Japan. Okay, I'd like to show why previous studies couldn't capture union effects in Japan. And most previous studies used simple OLS model to estimate wage function. They include a binary variable representing union status in the wage equation and estimate its marginal effect. I apply this model to the latest data, and here is the result. The model 1 shows that the observed union wage gap is 28%, which means the average wage in unionized firm is 28% higher than that in non-unionized firms. However, in model 2, when workers' characteristics are controlled for, 60 percentage points of union wage gap will be absorbed. in model 3 and 4, industry and occupation are further controlled for, but they don't change the size of union effects. Finally, in model 5, when firm size is controlled for, it absorbs further 10% point of union effect. The remaining union effect is only 2%, and it's no longer statistically significant. So it shows that union status largely overlaps with workers' characteristics and firm size. This is why previous studies had to conclude that there was no significant independent effect for union status. So we have to approach it in a different way. So we proceed to Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition to examine how workers' characteristics relate to union wage gap. And the result shows that half of the union wage gap comes from endowment, meaning that unionized firms have a higher concentration of better qualified workers. 1/3 of the union wage gap comes from coefficients, meaning that unionized firms have higher returns to workers' characteristics. And when we look at decomposition into each variables, the largest part comes from tenure, this yellow part, for all these three components. So this means the average tenure in unionized firms is longer, and also returns to tenure are higher. So tenure plays the most important role in union wage gap, and I will examine how this tenure, or more specifically the age, will affect the wage curve in the two groups. So I estimate the marginal effect of age in unions and firm size while controlling for other workers' characteristics. So this graph shows the marginal effect of each category of ages, taking age 20 to 24 as a base category. The gray line represents the wage curve in the non-unionized firm. The yellow line represents the wage curve in unionized firm, and orange line is the curve in unionized firm after controlling for firm size. So as for male workers, marginal effect of age increases steadily, even in the non-unionized firms. The effect of ages are consistently larger for unionized firms, which can be considered as a union effect. But when controlling for firm size, this union effect disappears before the age 40, but remains after that age. As for female workers, age effects in non-unionized firms does not increase as much as those for male workers. The age effects are consistently larger in unionized firm. When controlling for firm size, the union age after 40 remains and is more significant than for male workers. So the results suggest that unionized firms have managed to maintain the wage curve that increases with age. This wage structure is what Japanese union have long advocated for and should be considered as an important aspect of union effects in Japan. So lastly, we turn to the issue of wage dispersion. So union wage policies increases the union wage gap between different age groups, but it also reduces the wage dispersion within the same age group. So I decompose a log variance of wages into within age group and between age group variance to see if the union wage policy is still maintained. And these are the results. So the gray line represents total variance, the yellow line represents the between age group variance, and orange line represent within age group variances. As for males, we can see that union policies still remain. While total variance between the two groups are almost same, within age groups, which is orange line, represents is smaller in unionized firms, meaning there's less dispersion among people in the same age group. While within age group variance is increasing in non-unionized firms, it is rather stable in unionized firms. So as for female workers, wages are more dispersed within same age group compared to males in unionized firms. Also, it has been consistently larger in unionized firms than non-unionized firms, and it is still growing. So the results show that unionized firm has maintained wage distribution advocated by unions, and union effect on wage dispersion are different from men and women. So when we look at the union effects in Japan, we should not expect a simple wage increase, but have to look at the difference in wage structure. And the results show that unions have managed to maintain the wage structure that unions have advocated for a long time. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Suzuki, and thank you for the presentation. We do have one question for you, but I'm going to hold that till the end of all four presentations so that we make sure we have time for everyone. But you're welcome to certainly answer that question in the chat. Okay, moving on next to Professor Anil Verma. Verma. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Of the University of Toronto. Professor Verma is going to speak to us about low-wage work. Please, sir, take it away.
Okay, and we have what, 13 minutes?
That's correct, and I'll give you brief updates with 3 and 1 minute remaining in the chat.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay, can you see my slide now?
We can.
Okay, so good afternoon all. Sorry, it's on the wrong slide. Okay. My study is of low-wage workers, and I'm looking at motivation for upward mobility. The context for me is that if you look at policies aimed at the issue of low-wage work, we have policies like minimum wage, policies that have gained traction in recent decades all over the world, but they are controversial in the sense that many economists believe that it reduces employment by bidding up the price of labor. But you know, from a social point of view, the main problem with minimum wage is that it still does not provide enough income to support a family unit. And this is the reason why you can see that there is the campaign in the US for a $15 minimum wage. And that certainly helps, but it's not a solution by itself. There's the concept of living wage and also basic income or universal basic income. So my view is that while these policies are okay and they should be pursued, there is another tack that we can bring to the issue of low-wage workers. And to explain that, let me just share with you very briefly a case study. And I acknowledge the New York Times for telling us the story of 2 women. On the left is Marta Ramos, who is a janitor for Apple Computer in 2017, earning a wage rate of about $16.60 an hour. On your right is Gail Evans. She worked as a janitor for Eastman Kodak Company in Rochester, New York in the 1980s. Eastman Kodak, for those of you who are not familiar with the name, was the Apple computer of its time, a high-tech company enjoying a monopoly in the market. And they earned about the same if you adjust for inflation. It was around 1660 per hour. But that's where the similarity ends. Now look at what happened to Gail Evans on the right first. She was a full-time Kodak employee with benefits like health insurance, annual vacation, and more importantly, partial reimbursement for further education. She was considered part of the family. So she knew a lot of professional workers near her job. And they would talk to her about opportunities that could be open to her within Eastman Kodak. And in fact, she was laid off in the 80s once, but Kodak, again, being part of the family, they found her another job at a nearby plant. But over time, she started going to school at night, became a professional IT worker, rose to be an IT manager. And then when she retired from Kodak, went on to work as an IT manager in some of the companies. And as you can tell from the photographs, you know, she did well for herself. She's wearing a suit, she's in a nice office, etc. But in contrast, when reporters asked Marta Ramos, where do you expect that you will end up? And she said that she was afraid that she'll end her career as a janitor because she is a subcontracted employee with no benefits. She's considered an outsider. She knows nobody in Apple and doesn't know of any opportunities where she could climb up. So what is the moral of the story? Well, Gail had one key advantage over Marta, and that advantage in turn led to two other advantages. And those two are that Gail had employer-based benefits, that is tuition assistance and time off, and Gail knew Kodak employees and through them about career opportunities. So my approach is that many people take low-wage jobs for a variety of reasons, but nobody, almost nobody that we talk to or we survey sees themselves as being in a low-wage job for the rest of their lives. So I think policy should also address the issue of upward wage mobility. And in this vision, low-wage work is like a period of internship. And you know, a lot of us, when we were young and young people today, go through internship because the paradigm is low wage now because we are learning, and hopefully this will lead to higher wage. So I use a model in which three psychosocial constructs are very important for upward mobility. One is social capital. So remember, Gail Evans knew Kodak employees at Kodak, and she got information. So social capital has been shown to be very significantly related to new job opportunities and upward mobility. Self-efficacy, which is the psychological state that, yes, I can do it. That is the belief that I am capable of learning and I can move up. And expectancy regarding the fact that if you learned new skills, it would lead to new earnings. And I use this model to predict a variety of outcomes, but I just share with you briefly today three measures. One is the motivation to improve earnings. The second is propensity to leave their current job. And the third one is, have they taken a training course in the last 12 months? We collected data in Canada and US. I have samples of roughly 5,000 in Canada and 4,000 in the US. My survey was completed by March 2020. This is important because when the pandemic started, we ended the survey at that point in time. So we do not capture the pandemic period. And frankly, I didn't want to because it would have contaminated my data collected earlier. And I define low wages as people in the first quartile. And the comparison group I use is the third quartile. And if we have time, I'll explain why. I didn't use Q2 or Q4. Okay, very roughly, these patterns are not that different between Canada and US. I had expected to find some differences, but not really. And in terms of demographics and household location, work context characteristics, and job characteristics, these are pretty much along the lines that we already know in the literature. So in the interest of time, I'll skip this. In terms of the level of social capital, I just show you here in these blurbs that quartile 1, that is the low wage group, had higher social capital than the third quartile. Now, this was surprising because often it is held that these low wage workers don't have the resources to move up, but they do. They were also higher in self-expectancy. So they have this belief that they're underemployed and they can do better. Sorry. And there was no difference in self-efficacy. It was almost equal. This is in the Canadian data. And when we asked if they had access and resources for skill acquisition, they did report lower access. And that's the Canadian data. It was the same for the US, except for self-efficacy, which was found to be lower in the US sample. So here are very quickly my regression results. When we asked them, have you taken a course to improve your skills? It was negatively related to age, as expected. And it was positively related to wages per hour, which was also expected. But more importantly for my model, social capital, self-efficacy, and expectancy were all significant, very significantly positively related to whether they have taken a course. And these effects, the coefficients are a little bit up and down, and I don't have any theory about that, but they were positive in both the Canadian and US samples. The same thing, the same pattern repeats for the propensity to leave your current job. You know, this was my hypothesis that unless there is a push, unless there is a desire to do better, that they will not take action. So once again, we find the only different result here is in case of the Canadian data, sorry, social capital was negative. So even though they had more contacts and friends and family, they were less likely to say that I want to leave my job. And this may have to do with spatial distribution of the workforce in the two countries that might be different. And lastly, I also did the regression for motivation to increase your earnings. And this also falls in the similar pattern. I've skipped the coefficients in the interest of time. So let me summarize by saying that despite the ability and willingness to improve their station in life, many low-wage workers appear to be trapped in their work. Low-wage workers appear to have many resources necessary for upward mobility, but clearly those resources are not sufficient. So this sets us up for policy intervention. Results also suggest that improving access to training would increase their chances, especially true in the Canadian data where they said they have less access. And intervention to improve expectancy could also lead to more mobility because we know that it's positively related. Lastly, in terms of policy, I think that what we need is to create resources that are aimed directly at the low-wage workforce. So we should say to anyone who earns below a certain wage that, look, we have these programs for you to go and take training to improve your skills. We should also make a law that would force employers to give reasonably accommodate time off so that they can make time for training, taking training courses. And one could create a pilot program to validate this model, whether this is indeed true in practice or not. And this will become increasingly more important as we move into the post-pandemic job market, because this artificial intelligence and other types of technologies are coming, which will disrupt many of the low-wage jobs even further. And to conclude, I would say that we need to incorporate this as an additional strategy to complement other approaches to low-wage work. Thank you very much. I shall end there.
Thank you very much, Professor Verma. Very interesting research. Okay, we have one last presentation remaining. Next up is a team of 3 faculty members from a few different institutions. The presentation will be given by Professor Zhengxiong Yang of the Nanjing University of Finance and Economics. He is joined today by one of his co-researchers, Mingwei Liu, from the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University, which has been a steadfast supporter of LERA over the years. And third, not with us, but a member of the research group, Shiwei Zhang, of the Jilin University. And the research is on minimum wage effects in China. So without further ado, Professor Yang, please take it away.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, I'm Yang Zhengxiong. So it's about 3 a.m. here, but I'm still excited to join this session. So I believe we can say that this is the topic of our presentation: crossover design and evaluation of labor market effects of minimum wage in China. This paper is collaborated with Professor Zhang in Jilin University and Professor Liu in Rutgers University. So briefly, we have done 2 things. The first is that we propose a novel research design, which we refer to as a crossover design. The second is that we use the method to assess the minimum wage effect in China. So the difference is a popular method to get the causal effect of a treatment, and it relies on a common trend assumption. Since we are using observational data instead of experimental data, so we cannot just assume that the assumption is satisfied, and we need to do some tests to support this assumption. And it's usually necessary to conduct a placebo test, which checks whether the 2 groups share common trends before treatment. And it requires a data structure like this, like what's shown in this table. So in the first period, no one is treated. In the second period, the treatment is assigned to the treatment group. And that leads to our research question. So what if there are multiple treatments and the placebo tests are not feasible? So here is an example. By definition, there can be 4 types of 2 groups, 2 periods DID design, but only in type 1, we can do a placebo test. And there's little discussion on other types of data. In this paper, we will focus on the type 3, where the treatment group in the first period cross over to the control group in the second period. And we refer to this setup as a crossover design. In empirical studies, we find that the absence of placebo tests is very common in China's minimum wage studies, because the regulation requires that the provinces should adjust their minimum wages at least every 2 years. So with annual data, you will never be able to get a type 1 data. And we find there's also a debate over the common trend assumption in the recent US minimum wage studies. Recent extensions of the DID design mainly focus on staggered DID design. So in such design, there are multiple groups, and the units are allowed to be treated at a different point of time. But there is a irreversible treatment assumption, which assumes that if one is treated, it remains exposed to treatment afterward. Therefore, the staggered DID design does not allow for multiple treatments on the same unit. And a recent research also showed that the estimator is likely to be biased in the presence of treatment effect heterogeneity. So in this paper, as we have noted, we claim that in the presence of multiple treatments, crossover design can make credible inference on treatment effect without relying on the common change assumption. Actually, we first came up with this idea independently, but then we find there's already a crossover design in clinical research. However, we further find that the crossover design in clinical research cannot be applied to our analysis, and we will discuss the reason later. And also we find some literature try to use the reverse treatment to get a better estimate, but there is little discussion on assumptions and inferences and inference procedures of the crossover design, and that is the purpose of our paper. So before getting into the crossover design, it's first helpful to describe the treatment effects in the DID design. So with Robin's potential outcome framework, the DID estimator can be rearranged to so delta equals to tau, which is the treatment effect on treated, plus a selection bias nu. And the common trend assumption just assumes that nu equals to 0, but it's not observable. Now we are going to use this expression in our crossover design. So this table shows the basic setup of the crossover design. I think it's also necessary to compare the crossover design in our study with that in clinical studies. So in clinical studies, because they can do randomized experiment, so they can make sure that nu1 equals to nu2 equals to 0. And it turns out that their motivation to conduct a crossover design is to use fewer samples to attain the same level of statistical power or precision as a parallel design, or more directly, they want to save money. But in economic studies, we cannot design experiments to achieve the randomness. So our intuition to consider a crossover design is to make a robust inference when we cannot check for the pre-trend. So we need 3 assumptions to get the inference on the direction of the treatment effect. The assumption 1, it relies the common trend assumption. For instance, imagine we have 2 people, A and B, and we find that A's weight grows faster than B in the first week. Then the assumption 1 just assumes that without intervention, A's weight also grows faster than B in the second week. So this assumption can be plausible in many applications. And we have a stable treatment effect assumption. This assumption is commonly used in many extensions of DID design, but we will also discuss the situation when this assumption doesn't hold. Assumption 3 just requires that the signs of the treatment effects are similar, so it allows for a specific version of heterogeneity treatment effects. So it's also a less restrictive assumption. With only 3 assumptions, we are able to get 4 inference rules, which actually consider all the possibilities of the 2 DID estimator. For example, in rule 1, if we find the 2 DID estimators show the same sign, then it will be safe to say that the treatment effect exists. And I will skip reading this part. In the next step, we consider the performance of the crossover design when assumption 2 doesn't hold. This could happen if, for example, the wage effect of minimum wage effect may decrease over time, or the employment effect of minimum wage slowly show up over time. And our conclusion is that we can still make inference based on rule 1, but rule 2 to 4 fails. So that's the limitation of the crossover design. In the next step, we introduce 2 assumptions to get an estimate for the average treatment effect, ATE. And the intuition is that under these assumptions, we can eliminate the bias through the summing of 2 DID estimators. So to sum up, the violation of the common trend assumption does not necessarily fail the inference on the treatment effect. Under different assumptions, we have different rules, and it can be easily extended to more than 2 periods, as long as we have a data structure like a 10, 01, 10. And we actually find a 3 periods crossover design in our empirical part. Okay, so in our application, we use the data from China Migrant Dynamic Survey. It's a national representative data. It mainly focuses on migrant workers who are more likely to be affected by the minimum wage. And the standard of minimum wage increased a lot during the time period we analysis. So we should be able to expect a more clear evidence of minimum wage. We use the following criterion to make our matched group as comparable as possible. And so we have choose 3 groups of province to conduct the crossover design. So in the middle area, we choose Jiangxi and Anhui. In the western area, we choose the Sichuan and Chongqing. In the northeastern region, we choose the Jilin, Liaoning, and Heilongjiang. And from this table, you can find that the level of minimum wages are very similar within each matched group. In our model specification, we use a linear model for the wage equation and the probability model for the employment equation. And we use the method of Haney to get a treatment effect of the employment equation. In the results, we first report wage effects on high-skilled workers because theoretically, we know that the wage effects should be lower in high-skilled workers than in the low-skilled workers. So if our method is correct, we should at least be able to observe our expectation. And from the results here, we have 2 points. First, the common trend assumption holds in the first and second cases, but not in the third case. And for the third case, we may be able to get the average treatment effect through the summing of these 2 estimators. And that will lead to the same conclusion as the first and second cases. That is, the wage effects are insignificant among the high-skilled workers. In terms of low-skilled workers, we find significant positive wage effects, and the procedures are similar as the previous one. The results of the employment equations shows a positive employment effect for the first case. And for the second case, there can be 2 explanations. The first is that if we calculate the average treatment effect, we can say the effect is positive, but that requires the stable treatment effect assumption. Or it's more safe to say that the effect is not negative. That can be a more robust inference. And we have conducted some robust tests. For example, we combine the crossover design with the propensity score matching method. We also conclude the self-employment workers, and we have conducted a 3-period crossover design, and the conclusions are all similar. Also, we make a discussion about our results. So based on the monopsony theory, our results are valid on 2 conditions. First is that employer has a stronger monopsony power. Second is that the level of minimum wage is not so high, and we have found relevant evidence for these 2 conditions.
Professor Yang, just sorry to
So,
interrupt, but yeah, oh, you're at your conclusion. Great. We're right at the top of the hour. Thank you.
yes. So I will end here. So in the crossover design, researchers can obtain reliable inference on treatment effects, not resting on the common trend assumption. It can also help to identify spurious results. And the increase of minimum wages has a positive effect on the wages and employment of the low-skilled workers. So the policy implication is that there is still a range for the current minimum wage to be increased. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and please let me know if you have any questions or suggestions. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Professor Yang, and thank you again, Professor Liu, who I know has joined us as well. We have used every minute of our hour and going a minute over, but I did want to loop back through a few questions in the chat. If there's anyone that wants to ask a brief question, certainly you can raise your hand if you'd like to stay on the line for another minute or two. But one question did come in from Professor Liu for Ms. Suzuki, which asked about whether the research on union effect of wages in Japan controlled for firm age or history, and Ms. Suzuki responded that it did not.
Okay, thank you for the question. I didn't control for the firm age or history, but I think that's a good point because all Japanese companies tend to have unions and also tend to maintain the traditional Japanese employment system. So it might be an important factor for evaluating union effects. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Suzuki. And Professor Verma, if you have a moment, we had a brief question from Professor Liu as well about your study, and the question was regarding how is social capital measured?
Yeah, you know, my measure in the social capital is a very simple measure. And there were basically two questions. One is that I have family members with whom I have talked about the possibility of better paying jobs. And the same question about that I have friends with whom I have talked and I'm able to talk on a regular basis. So it's just like a 2-item measure. I should point out that my data were collected through the internet, and I hired a polling agency called SINT. And SINT has panels of people who respond to these surveys. So of necessity, I had to be very brief, and so the measure is quite simple. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Verma, and thank you, Professor Liu, for the question. One last question before we go. This is from Professor Yang for Mr. Hinkel regarding the effects of prevailing wage laws on workers moving from informal to formal employment or elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was actually in the process of responding in the chat before this came up, but that's a great point. And I think my study mainly considers how prevailing wages affect firm behavior rather than worker behavior. So I don't really get into how it affects workers, but I could definitely see, to your point, if there's a prevailing wage law in place, that might entice workers who especially might work in a related industry to want to move to construction and start working in construction because, you know, there are more protections there. So that's a great point.
Thank you, Mr. Hinkel. And thank you, Professor Yang, for the question. Okay, we've gone a few minutes over. I'm sure folks are worn out from a very long conference here and another long day. But I want to thank our researchers and presenters for their work today. Let's give them a round of applause very briefly. I want to thank everyone who's attended the conference here as well. As we mentioned earlier, this has been recorded, so if there are others that you think might benefit from this discussion, you can find that link on the LERA website. later, and you can also find all of this this research and these presentations on the website as well.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the
Thank
other.
you, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.